Hey, I'm Colin. I'm 20 years old now, but the story I'm going to tell began quite a while ago. Here's the thing. I am the biological father of my dad's newborn son, and I kind of want to become a real dad for the kid. When I was 8 years old, I used to spend a lot of time with my best friend, Jerry. He often stayed at my place overnight, so much that my mom even jokingly called us her two sons. Jerry's sister, Annie, who was 10 years older than us, usually came to pick him up to take him home. I was in love with Annie. I remember once, I even asked my mom to invite Annie for a pie when she, as usual, came for Jerry. You know, I wanted to spend some time sitting next to her at the table. But apparently she was more interested in the adult stories that my dad was telling. That wasn't very surprising, by the way. My dad has always been that type of man, who instantly made all the women around fall in love with him, no matter if they were little girls or old ladies. But he always said that my mom was the love of his life. That's probably why it was so shocking when, one day, I came home from school and found my parents arguing with each other. My mom was crying, and just as soon as she saw me, she turned her face down from me, trying to hide her tears. Of course, nobody explained anything to me back then, and all I had known was that my dad was going to live separately from us for a little while. And that night I was lying in my bed, trying to figure out any possible explanation for what had happened. I heard my mom crying all night long, but I couldn't decide whether I should try to calm her down or leave her alone. So, from time to time, I would go up to the door of her bedroom, but then walk away. Even stranger things began happening the next day. Just like usual, after school, Jerry and I went to my place to stay overnight. But when we entered the house, Mom was sorta not in the mood, and she drove Jerry back home. And during the whole next week, she forbade me to invite Jerry, saying that I had something important that needed to be done, together with her. But she simply ended up cleaning the house, for example, while I had to stay in my room to keep out of her way. Once, I decided to stay at Jerry's place myself, in order to not bother my mom. But as soon as she found out, she came to take me home. I didn't understand anything, and she wouldn't explain to me why I wasn't allowed to hang out with my best pal. That made me angry with her, and we began arguing all the time. One day I got so pissed off that I told her that I wanted to live with my dad. Her face immediately changed. I don't think I've ever seen her that furious and decisive before. She called my dad, and in an hour or so I was already sitting inside his car while he was driving to his new place. At that moment, Dad and I hadn't seen each other for a whole month, and I kind of missed him badly. But at the same time, for some strange reason, our conversation felt really heavy. My dad drummed on the dashboard as if he didn't know what to talk to me about. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it, but when we finally arrived at his apartment building, he said that I was about to not only see his new place, but also to meet someone who he was living with. But what was really shocking is when he opened the door and I saw Annie, my best friend's sister, sitting on the couch. That just totally blew my mind. Annie came up to me and tried to hug me, saying that she was glad that I finally knew the truth, but I dodged her hugs. I finally began realizing what was going on. It turned out that my dad and Annie had been having an affair. I felt like I was about to throw up, so I rushed to the bathroom. I was sitting there on the cold floor trying to put my thoughts in their places, but the whole situation was so absurd. At least, I found out why my mom has been so mean to Jerry lately. His older sister stole her husband. I immediately took my cell phone out of my pocket and called Jerry. I thought that this was definitely something I should tell him about, but it turned out that he was already aware of Annie and my dad. He just didn't think that he was the one who should have told me that, because it was kind of not his business. I couldn't believe that this was happening for real. I got so mad at him that I threw my phone into the wall. It hit the mirror and both of them shattered. Obviously, having heard all this rumble, my dad began knocking on the bathroom door and shouting that I had to get out from there, but I didn't care. I was angry and offended, and I didn't even notice how tears had started to flow from my eyes. Years have passed now. Mom and Dad officially divorced, and they shared custody of me so that I had to spend a few weekends and holidays with him and Annie. I never managed to forget Jerry's betrayal, and he apparently didn't think that he was wrong, because he never actually tried to apologize. So we kind of stopped being friends since then. We didn't even talk to each other during the wedding of my dad and Annie. By the time I turned 18, I had sort of gotten over the whole situation and no longer thought that it was miserable or anything, until one day, when my dad invited me to a restaurant to say that he wanted to ask me for a huge favor. What I heard from him can rightfully be considered number one in the ranking of strange and abnormal requests from parents to their children. My dad said that because of his age, he apparently had some health issues. He didn't want Annie to know that he was to be blamed for the fact that she couldn't get pregnant. So he was hoping that I could help him with that, by becoming a donor of DNA. He thought that way the baby would really be his baby, genetically. I was so taken aback by these words. I indignantly said that he was insane so loudly that it seemed that even the music stopped playing in the restaurant. I was sure that everyone around us was looking at us. Of course, I rapidly got up and left the place. My dad kept calling me on my cell phone, but I definitely wasn't ready to discuss that issue any longer. He texted me that he was ready to do anything to make his young wife happy, so I could ask him for virtually anything in return. That was extremely outrageous. But by the time I got back home, I was ready to tell my dad that he could go to hell with asking favors like these, but not until I saw an envelope from the university I had applied to in the mailbox. It was already the third time I had been turned down for a scholarship. That made me really upset, and I knew that my mom would get disappointed. Besides, she didn't have enough money to send me to study where I wanted to go. So there I was, standing in the middle of the living room, holding that letter in one hand and my mobile phone in the other, with a text from my dad. Right at that moment, everything seemed so easy and obvious to me. So in a few days, I already had enough money to pay tuition for the university in full, and even for a new car. I told my mom that I managed to get a scholarship to make her really proud of me, and the car was, allegedly, a gift from my dad, congratulating me for that. You can be sure that Dad and I kept everything a secret. He was very happy when his plan worked out, and Annie got pregnant right away, and then gave birth to a healthy little boy. By the way, I don't have a clue how he managed to convince doctors to use my biological material instead of his own, while keeping it a secret from his wife. And honestly, I didn't have any intentions of finding that out. But when I came to see them to get acquainted with my newborn brother, strange things began happening inside me. I felt so much warmth and tenderness for this little man. It was clear that I couldn't always be near him, but my thoughts about him didn't leave me for a minute. And then one day, Dad and Annie asked me to look after little Jonathan for a couple of hours. I was so happy to stay with him that I even started calling him my son. I liked the way it sounded, and I started daydreaming about the parented thing so much that I didn't notice how Dad and Annie had returned home. I noticed that tears came to my dad's eyes and that he immediately went into another room, while I, embarrassed by the fact that Annie heard everything, hurried to leave their home. The next day, Annie called me. She was extremely nervous and asked me to come over. That worried me, too. She'd never called me before, and this time, something must have happened. When I finally got there, I figured out that she kicked my dad out of their apartment. It turned out that when he saw me being so tender with Jonathan the other night, he couldn't help but tell Annie the truth about who the real father of the baby was. That made Annie furious, and she told my dad that she didn't want him there any longer. Gosh, I was standing there and didn't know how to act or what to say, but then she suddenly said that it was up to me whether I wanted to parent Jonathan or not. For now, a few months have passed since that happened. I transferred to another university to be able to see Jonathan as much as possible, but I had to move in with Annie because my mom, who apparently now also knows the truth, won't even talk to me. There's nothing romantic between Annie and me, but to be honest, lately I've started feeling the attraction toward the mother of my child. And my dad, well, he keeps supporting Annie financially because officially he is still Jonathan's father. but I am going to adopt him very soon.